Hello, global gardeners. It's great to be back. Hello to Heidi and Jay, our fantastic moderators, and everyone else who's joining us today. Nice that you could be here, Bowtie Life. I'm glad that Mrs. Bowtie Life has given you the opportunity. It's a wonderful day because we weren't here last week. And like many of you, I always look forward to getting together on these Mondays. So I think I've got my computer issues solved and we're moving forward. And today, I think it would be nice to focus on what happens in the garden and things we can do in the garden when the seasons change to get us ready for whatever the next season might be. And so let's start with a good question from B. Deer. Morning to you. When to bring plants inside before the frost? And so this is a really important issue depending on what type of plants you might be talking about. So let's start with plants that are in pots. And it's the outdoor plants that we need to bring in because if they're exposed to the frost, it could, at a minimum, cause damage and in some cases kill those plants. Well, as I've said many times before, I'm always looking at the forecast, what's coming. And that's the first step. If you can see the frost coming, then it gives you that opportunity to prepare to bring the plants in. Now, I like to give myself a little bit of leeway. I like a buffer when I garden because I can never choose the perfect day, the perfect time to do all the things that need to happen. So for me, when it comes to those plants that need to be brought indoors, I'm not waiting for the frost to actually be forecast. When the temperature starts dropping below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 4.5 degrees Celsius, that's the time I start bringing the plants in. In my area of Colorado, we can have a forecast of 40 degrees Fahrenheit and then hit a frost because it just is the mountains and high altitude. And the forecasting is not an exact science in our region. So for me, use that buffer, that 4.5 degrees Celsius, that 40 degree Fahrenheit. And when the temperatures drop to that point overnight, bring your potted plants in that you want to save because you're worried that the cold is going to damage them. And you could easily do it before that point. You don't have to wait, but that's one of those considerations. Now, there are other plants, and I'll be doing a video about this in the future, that need chill hours. They do need some exposure to cold temperatures. So if you have one of those plants, a fruiting tree or a fruiting bush that needs cold, then it becomes a whole nother level. So I'm growing a pomegranate tree, believe it or not, in a pot. Pomegranates don't do well in Colorado because it just gets too cold over the winter. But they do need exposure to cold temperatures below that 40 degree threshold. So for those type of plants that require the exposure to cold, you kind of have to just accept that it's going to get cold, but not kill the plant down to a certain point. So for instance, the pomegranate, I'm going to leave it outside, let it get exposed to those cold nights, let it be exposed to some frosts, but when it gets to the hard freeze point, at 28 degrees Fahrenheit, about -2 Celsius, that's when cellular damage can affect a lot of the plants that we're growing outside. So for those that can handle some cold and actually may need some chill, I let it go to that point. But again, it's up to the forecast to determine when it reaches that point that I need to be proactive and bring the plants in before there's any cellular damage. And then as far as how to prepare them to reduce pests, it depends on the type of pest. So there are a number of pests that we have in our gardens that like to overwinter in the plants or on the plants or under the plants. And so that's one of the things I wanted to talk about today as well. As the seasons change, particularly going from summer to fall, but also moving from winter to spring, that's when some of these insects are going to be pretty active. And so the adult insect might be laying eggs inside the plant or in the soil or on the leaves of the plants. And if you just leave those plants out in your garden, they'll overwinter. Or in the spring, they might be waking up and looking for those young seedlings to eat. So this is a really good time of year, I think, to begin that cleanup of your garden, because that's a very important aspect of pest control. If you can break their life cycle, if you can keep the larva from emerging from the soil and then giving it a nice young plant to eat, then you've eliminated that problem. If you can keep the insect from laying eggs on the leaves and then those leaves resting in a nice warm pile of leaves over the winter, if you can keep that from happening, then you can eliminate that pest. And so when I look at those type of things, particularly this time of year for me, moving from summer to fall, it's cleaning up the garden. It's starting to recognize that the insects are beginning to prepare for overwintering as well. And if I can take away that opportunity for them, then I can greatly reduce the problem I have in the future. Right now in my raspberry patch, I've noticed about 3 or 4 weeks ago, some of the canes were dead and falling over. And it was an experiment for me this year. I left some of my canes up last winter to see if I have raspberry cane borer in this new house. I had that problem at a previous house. And it looks like some of my canes that I had left up did have the raspberry cane borer. So that tells me as I move forward, I can't leave any of my canes up over the winter. I've got to cut all the canes down to get rid of that pest so that it doesn't become a problem next year for any canes I leave up. So that's one of the most important things I think you can do, is just keep your garden clean so that you can eliminate some of those pests that will be coming next year. Okay, it's nice that we have the good crowd. It's always nice to see the regulars. I want to say good morning to Yankee Sister Homestead as well. Always nice to have you here. And here's a question from Heather Lawless about live cilantro and basil from the store. What do I do to prevent pests, or did I bring them in? So that's a really good question. As we talk about bringing those plants inside, we could be bringing pests into our house that could then devastate some of our household plants. And the house plants are usually clean. They usually don't have much in the way of pests. So when we bring them in, it really can cause a lot of damage. First off, if you're going to be bringing some of those plants from the outside indoors, it's always nice to give them a good hard spray of water. Try to blow off any pests that might be hiding on the leaves or any of those eggs. Do a little search underneath the leaves before you bring those outside plants inside. And so it's the same even with basil or cilantro, which tend to be a little more tender, but do an inspection before you bring the plants inside if you can, to try to eliminate those pests. And you can also quarantine them. Put them in an area away from your other houseplants. So cilantro and basil is most often used in the kitchen. Go ahead and bring those plants in and put them on a countertop in a corner, and then keep an eye on them, because once they come indoors, and especially the nighttime temperatures might be substantially different for some of those pests. They're going to like the warmer indoor temperatures, so they'll probably be more active inside than they might be outside. And so keep an eye on those plants and try to see if the pests appear. And if they do appear, deal with them right away. Squish them with your fingers, put them underneath the faucet to wash them down the drain. But it's an awareness, and it's the focus on those plants with that pest in mind, so that you can try to keep them from being a problem. 1 or 2 aphids that pop up on a basil plant isn't a problem, especially when you first see it and you deal with them right away and wash off those aphids. But if you're not paying attention, before you know it, the whole plant can be infested and it can spread to other areas of your house. And so just be aware of that. It's one of those problems that we often bring in ourselves. It's a self-induced problem. And so just like cleaning the garden overall can help eliminate some of those pests, cleaning the plants that we're bringing indoors before they come indoors can also eliminate some of those pests. Jay is wondering, could you comment about chop and drop mulch in autumn versus clean up for pests? Thanks. So when I say clean up your garden, I'm basically talking about if you have a bunch of plants of any type. So you've pulled out all of your cucumber plants, or you pull out all your tomato plants, and then you throw them into a pile in the corner of the garden, and you'll get to it later, or you'll chop them up and add them to your compost pile later. It's those piles of the garden cuttings and the dead plants that are the areas that a lot of these pests are looking for. They want to be in a pile of dead leaves because they'll be protected from predators and it's warmer than the outside air. So it's those kind of things when I say clean up the piles, clean up the messes, clean up an area that looks like an insect would really like to hide in. As far as the chop and drop, now we're talking about little pieces. And so peppers you can easily chop and drop. Excuse me. Especially if you're planning on overwintering and digging up those peppers. You're going to be cutting off some of the branches, you're going to be cutting off the tips, you're going to be doing a good pruning on the pepper plants. Well, as you're doing the pruning, as you're cutting off those little pieces, just let them drop. It becomes a mulch or more mulch that goes on top of the mulch you already have in your garden, and it helps protect the soil over the winter. I prefer to do that with the woodier kind of plants, or the plants that resemble a lot of the mulches we use. So peppers, you can trim that off and let it drop. Flowers, a lot of the flowers that begin to die in the fall, I'll cut those as I'm cleaning up the garden. I'll let the flower heads drop, I'll let the stems drop. But when we talk about like the cucumbers and the tomatoes that have more of a vining stem and a thicker stem, I usually will cut those off and then add them to the compost pile rather than leave them in a pile someplace else. And because of the bigger leaves on some of those plants, it adds the opportunity to be a hiding place for those insects. So for me, chopping and dropping, which is trimming off a plant and letting the pieces of the plant fall, I do that with smaller stems and smaller leaves and flower heads, and that also helps keep the garden cleaner without those big leaves and big stems and big vines becoming a hiding spot for those pests that want to reappear in the spring and devastate our garden. 2000 Vermont, hello to you. I would like to overwinter some herbs and rosemary in the greenhouse this winter. Would I treat them with neem or insecticidal soap before? Also, I'm doing greens as well. So yes, generally, so neem oil is not harmful to humans, but it does taste bad. And so generally, we aren't going to spray a plant that we're going to eat with neem oil. But if you're overwintering it, especially for a period of months, I don't see a problem spraying neem oil at all. In fact, actually, neem oil can be really good if you start having some of those pests appear. And then later, when you're going to be harvesting the rosemary and other herbs, you can just wash them off really well to get rid of any of that taste that the neem oil might give you. Insecticidal soap can also be good. Same thing. Wash it off well at the point you're going to be harvesting, but that could be many months down the road. So in the short term, especially in a greenhouse, to keep problems like that under control, neem oil and insecticidal soap can definitely be an option. The thing about both of those is that if you spray the plant before you have an insect pest, then you're kind of wasting it. The way both the neem oil and the insecticidal soap work is that when it gets on the insect, then the insect is affected and eventually dies. And so the neem oil on the leaves with no pests is really doing no good. It's just a waste of good neem oil. But if you see the pest and then spray the neem oil, and the neem oil gets on the pests, then the pests will die as a result of it. So they're not really good preemptive insecticidal remedies. And that's why I say when you focus on the plants that you're moving inside so you can catch those pests early, then you can treat them. And the same with in the house. If you're bringing, like we were saying just a few minutes ago, bringing the herbs in the house, once you see those pests, then you can bring out the neem oil. I use neem oil mostly as an indoor plant treatment. I rarely use neem oil outside. It's usually an indoor thing because I'm keeping track of my plants and looking for those insects. And that's when you'd really want to use it. So as far as treating them before you bring them into the greenhouse, unless you know that you've got a problem already with those pests in the greenhouse and now you're bringing plants in and you're worried about the new plants being infected, and you could be a little preemptive, but you're really kind of wasting the time and effort and the neem oil and insecticidal soap if you don't already have the insects that are on the plants, and that's really the big difference. Tennessee Nana's wondering, what about putting those questionable things into a bucket of water or compost tea? Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, I said spray it with a hose or put it under the faucet. Same thing. Yeah, absolutely. You could put the whole pot into a bucket of water and the plant as well, then pull it out. And that's also a good way to ensure that the roots are nice and moist as you move them from the outdoor environment to the indoor environment. And it could drown something that might be a pest that might be in the soil, but at a minimum can help wash off the leaves and the stems where some of those pests might be living. So absolutely, that is an easy way to deal with some of the plants before you move them in, is in a big bucket of water. Just douse the whole plant and leave it sitting there for a little bit, and it helps take care of it. So see that In the Garden with Eli and Kate is with us today. So hello to you. I was going to talk about it, and I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end. But because of my friends Eli and Kate, I'm starting to venture more into the world of Instagram. And so Eli and I chatted yesterday about Instagram. I do have a Gardner Scott Instagram page, and so I've never really done much with it. My focus is mostly on YouTube, but I'm starting to do more with Instagram. It's kind of like a behind the scenes. You see my videos, but the Instagram is going to show some of the stuff that I'm not making a video about. It'll be what's happening in my garden and maybe what I'm doing in my garden. And I recognize, with the thanks of Eli, that often it's two completely different audiences. And so that's one reason why I've never really done much with Instagram, because I'm a YouTube guy. But I just want to let you all know that I'm venturing in that direction. And if you are an Instagrammer, then check out the Gardner Scott channel and start seeing some of those things I'm going to be posting. I've already put more up in the last week than I've put up in the last 4 or 5 years, however long I've had that account. So I'm looking forward to having some fun with all that. Blue Veil Meadows, ALDs, hello to you. When saving marigold seeds, if the flower head goes moldy after you've plucked it, are the seeds then bad? Plucked after it died on the plant, of course. So not necessarily. So the thing about mold is that mold requires moist conditions, and the seeds need to be dried when we save them. And so the mold might be because of the flower petals adding moisture to that dying flower. Could be rain, it could be high humidity. And so the seeds themselves, the outside of the seed is exposed to that moist condition, and that's what the mold will grow on. Once it dries, it'll kill the mold, and the seed should be okay. Unless it's been in that wet, moldy environment for a long time and the seed has begun to rot, the seed should be okay if you've been able to avoid that. So a little bit of mold is usually no big deal. Put the seeds in the sun for a little bit off of the plant before you bring them inside, and that'll help kill the mold. And then keep them in a dry location as well. That'll help ensure that they stay viable. But to be sure, do a viability test. Take some of those seeds and put them in a moist paper towel inside a plastic bag and see if they germinate. If you have good germination, then the seeds are going to be fine. And that's really anytime you have an issue with questionable seeds, before you spend the time of saving them and storing them, do a viability test. And I have a video, no doubt Jay will find it. I'd have some of my seed saving videos where I show viability tests that I've done. And a simple way is to take 10 seeds, put it on a moist paper towel in that environment, like a plastic bag, so it'll stay moist. Put it in a warm location, like on top of the refrigerator, and give it a few days to see if it germinates. Pull that plastic bag out, take out the moist paper towel, see what the percentage is of those 10 seeds that you put in, and that'll give you an idea of whether it's worth your effort. And so, of course, if 10 out of 10 germinate, then you've got 100% viability, and obviously mold is not an issue with those seeds. If you only have 5 out of the 10 for a 50% viability, that's about the point that I think it's probably not worth saving the seeds and maybe going to the other flowers you might have that weren't exposed to the mold. But it's not a bad thing. It's just a question of whether you're making the best use of your time when you have seeds that were exposed to those moist conditions that enabled the mold to develop in the first place. So the bow tie life, thank you for that. Loving the back and forth on those videos that Eli and Kate and I are doing. Really good. So it was my video that I released this last week, but most of it was Eli with her new green stock. So if you haven't seen my latest video, check it out, because it's not just me. It's really some good tips and good information coming from Eli in the first year that they were growing their plants in their green stock, and they're moving on to grow new plants. And so for me, and this is a good segue back into the topic of the day, I've let most of the plants that are in my green stock go to seed. The lettuces, the radishes, the basil, I've let those plants stay in the green stock after harvest, and I'll be collecting those seeds. I think the green stock is a great way to grow the plants to the point that you can then harvest the seeds for the next season. Because one of the reasons I do this is my season's almost over, my growing season. It's going to be cold here real soon. And the green stock, like most container growing, they're going to get colder earlier. In the big raised beds and in the ground, the soil temperatures tend to stay more moderate and gradually cool down. But the containers, especially the tall green stalks, when they're exposed to the cold temperatures, the soil temperature within them will cool down dramatically when compared to an in-ground bed. So I don't do much fall and no winter growing in my green stalks. I let my plants go to seed and then collect those seed. But in an area like Scotland, where generally the temperatures are more moderate, they're not getting those severe cold days like I am. they're able to grow more. And that's what Eli and Kate are doing right now, is growing their fall and winter plants in their green stocks. So if you live in an area where your winters are not as harsh, check out that video and maybe get some ideas as they're preparing for their garden as the temperatures are dropping. So so apparently I'm an Insta gardener now. So is that what Instagram gardeners are called? I didn't know that. See, I'm new to Instagram, so that's a new terminology. I'm an Insta gardener. So thanks for that, Eli. I appreciate it. And so as we make that transition, look at those differences within your garden. Look at how you're going to treat your containers as the temperatures are dropping, compared to how you treat your raised beds or your in-ground beds as the temperature is dropping. And that's one of the things about gardening that new gardeners are exposed to for the first time at the end of that first season, and even some more experienced gardeners take time figuring out, is that the garden is not the same throughout the garden. The different parts of the garden and the different plants and the different ways we grow those plants have different timelines. And so the in-ground plants that I'm growing, my perennials, my fruit trees, my fruit bushes, they still have a lot of time. The soil in those areas won't freeze here in my Colorado garden until usually mid-December. But the raised beds, while they do stay relatively moderate in the soil temperature, they'll freeze a little bit earlier, maybe a week or two before that point. The soil temperature in my raised beds gets down to that freezing point. And then, like I mentioned, the containers will be frozen even weeks before that. And so you can't grow the same plant in different containers or beds and expect that it's all going to be the same. You need to modify how you grow plants. So the strawberries I have in my raised beds need to be treated differently than strawberries that I would be growing in a container. And that's completely different from the strawberries that would be growing in the ground in a protected area. So start taking a look at some of those things as you move into the end of a season and recognize the differences. Note how the plants are growing differently in different areas. And that's one reason why I like to grow the same plant in different areas, so that I can compare the differences in their growth and their harvest and even pests over the course of the season. It's one of those kind of things that's I think of it as like a next level of gardening, when you can not only recognize it but now use it to your benefit. So my black cherry tomatoes, for instance, in the greenhouse have just done so fantastic this year that it's going to affect how I grow next year. Of course, I'll be doing more tomatoes in the greenhouse next year, and I'll choose a different variety. But the black cherries that I'm growing outside the greenhouse in my regular beds, they're doing okay, but nowhere near as good as they were in the greenhouse. There are some of the other plants that are actually doing better outside. Eli and Kate and I were doing the comparison of the plants that we were growing, and we used those Oasis boxes in the greenhouse. My black crim tomatoes in the greenhouse didn't do so well in those containers. They're doing great outside the greenhouse. In fact, that's one of my recent posts on Instagram, is showing how wonderful my black crim tomatoes are looking in an outside bed. So recognizing all those differences and then using them to your advantage as you move forward can really make a big difference. Shandy's Garden is saying, like it would be cool to have a Gardner Scott's Global Gardeners. I will hit the message button to send one from his page. Interesting. So I like the idea of Gardner Scott's Global Gardeners. So thanks for that idea. Jay's saying, could we get a link or name for your Instagram page? been unable to find it. So it's Gardner Scott. So the way Instagram works is use the little @ symbol. And so I think you could just go to a search and either type in Gardner Scott or do the @ Gardner Scott, and then that should take you there. But since we have Eli on today, maybe Eli will be able to answer that question if I'm slightly mistaken. But yeah, it's Gardner Scott on Instagram. But it's still a new page. I only have like half a dozen posts, and I think I've got 50 followers. So we'll see how many we can add today as a result of it. So it might not be the first thing that pops up if you put in Gardner Scott, but you should be able to find it if you do a little bit of a search, and that'll help. When we're done here on my community page on YouTube, I'll go ahead and put a link to it. And in fact, actually, YouTube has just redone the way they do links. So I used to have a link to Instagram, and they redid it. So I think on my homepage on YouTube, there's now a little window that says something like other links or more links. And it's possible that YouTube already has that link on my page. But I'll go ahead and post a message, and I'll put the link in the message and see if that helps. And so Eli's saying those boxes just didn't do it for me either. Yeah, we were talking about the Oasis boxes. So that's one of those lessons that we try new things. That's why I always say experiment and try new things, because you never know what you're going to find that you like, and you never know what you're going to find that you don't like. And so we both had great plans and desires and hopes for the Oasis bed, or Oasis, it's not a bed, Oasis pot this year, and it was just disappointing. But that's a lesson. And so I'm going to use them again next year in a different way and try to see if I can find what the best way to use them is, but it's not for growing tomatoes. I think we both agree with that. So Barbara York Woodside's wondering, how do you put your green stalks to bed? So I actually have a video about this that I did, I think I might have done 2 years ago. It might be from a year ago. But I show exactly how I put my green stalks to bed. And so there's a couple ways you can treat it. And in the video, I show some of what I do. Last year, actually 2 years ago, what I did was to empty the soil out of the green stalk. And that's at the point I was building the bed in my greenhouse. So I took all of the potting mix, all that soil that was in my green stalk, I dumped it into my greenhouse, and then I just stacked up each of those tiers of the green stalk and put them into my garage for the winter. Last year, I left the soil in, and because I have another video that shows how I revitalized the soil. So that's another option, is not to empty them, but just to leave the soil in. And then in spring, as one of my springtime activities, about this time when the season changes and moves from winter to spring, I go out and now I add more potting soil and add more slow release fertilizer to my green stalk tiers to prepare for the spring growing. Now, Eli shows that in the video that I did last week. That's one of the things that Eli is working on, is adding the soil to the bed. She's pulling out the plants, and that's another part of it. Those dead plants, you can either leave them in place for cleaning up in spring, or as part of your fall cleanup, like Eli shows, you pull the plants, add more soil, and then if you're going to move into fall or winter planting, you've got good soil. Or you just stack them in a nice sheltered area for the winter, and in the spring, they're all ready to go. You don't have to do that revitalizing of the soil in the springtime. So it all depends how much space you have. I also have covers for my green stalks. And so depending on the time of year, but particularly for some of that winter protection, that's why I did this last year, was I just left the soil in the green stalks and then put that cover over them and moved them off to the side and just let them sit all winter long. And then once the temperatures started warming up again in late winter, took the cover off, revitalized the soil, and then they were all ready for my spring planting. So that's the basics of it. There's a few other things, and you can check out that video to see how I put my green stalks to bed for the winter, because I can't be growing in them. It's just too darn cold in my area. CJ Don's wondering, could I discuss winter composting in prep for the next season? So yeah, that's a real good point, or a real good idea of something to talk about. And so for many of us, composting is something we want to do, we want to try to do, but we might not have enough material to compost. And so the end of the season, the time that you're maybe right now for some of us starting to clean up those garden beds, compost becomes the target. Put that material into your compost pile, because I think, and I'm relatively guilty of this, I think a lot of gardeners really don't think about their compost until spring. And then they think, okay, I'm going to be composting. And then there's nothing growing in early spring for them to put in their compost pile. And so it's really hard to get compost going in the springtime, because you need a pretty good volume of plant material. And you need the greens and the browns, the nitrogen and the carbon mix. And without that volume of plant material, you're really not going to get an active compost pile. Well, do that in the winter. Go ahead and take all of those pepper plants and cucumber plants and the dying flowers and everything else you have in your garden and get them into your compost bin or put them into a pile. And then you've got a couple options as far as winter composting. You can keep a compost pile hot even in the winter. If you start with that big volume, a lot of mass that is in that space, then it will begin breaking down even when the temperatures are cool. As long as it's moist, as long as there's the food to eat, which is the plants, and as long as there's the oxygen so that those microbes can stay alive, they'll begin generating heat. And get out there, periodically turn your pile. Even when there's snow on top of it, that's a great way to add moisture to your pile. You turn it, that snow comes in, it melts, it heats back up again, and you can compost during the winter. Covering it with a tarp or some plastic to help hold in that heat and keep it from freezing around the edges can help. It's work. I think it's more work to maintain a hot pile in winter than it is to maintain a hot pile in summer. But it's definitely an option for your compost to get it all done in fall and then just keep composting through the winter. The approach I take, because I don't want to take all that effort in the middle of winter when the wind is blowing and it's snowy and it's cold, is put all of that material in my compost bin. I'll put the greens and the browns in a big pile and then just let it sit over the winter. It's not going to be breaking down. It's too cold for those microbes to be at work. And so I have a big pile of garden material that's just waiting to decompose. And then when the temperatures warm up in late winter and early spring, the microbes will spring back to life. And because I already have this big volume of plant material ready to go, I can get my compost pile jump started. Now, most of those greens will have turned brown, so you might need to add a new nitrogen source, maybe some alfalfa pellets or a nitrogen fertilizer, some manure in springtime, but jumpstart your pile with something in the green category of nitrogen, and you've already got all the rest of the plant material. So that's my approach to winter composting, is just to get everything ready to go, and then once the springtime hits, all I have to do is just give it that extra boost of nitrogen, and I've got a compost pile that's heating up and decomposing. And usually about midsummer, I have a really good amount of compost. So it's just a question of how much effort you want to put into it as to whether it'll be composting and hot in winter or cold and lazy in winter, and then jump started in springtime. Ladies Gardening Home is wondering, my strawberries have battled a bad fungus all summer. Any tips on what to do before winter to kill off the fungus and not the plants? Or do I need to rip them out and start fresh? And so this kind of gets back to what we were talking about with the mold on the seeds. And so a fungus that's growing in the open air is going to signify that those strawberry plants and that area of the garden is wet. It's moist. It's moist enough for the fungus to stay alive. And so I don't like to say rip out the plants, because if you can dry off the plants and kill the fungus and then mulch around the area, I like to use my pine needle or pine straw mulch to help add that drainage on the surface. The surface stays dry, but underneath it's still moist enough for the plants. And so a mulch around the strawberries can help keep the top dry and the bottom moist so that the plants don't die off. That can help. Trimming off any of those leaves that have the fungus on them is definitely a way to start. So trimming off the leaves, having a nice dry mulch like pine needles, and then exposing the surface to the sun to dry out are some preliminary steps. You could use a copper-based fungicide to kill the fungus. That's always a possibility whenever you have something like that. So you can look at getting a fungicide if you want to take that kind of approach. As long as the crown of the strawberry, that center part of the plant, still looks like it's alive and it isn't rotting from the moist conditions that are promoting the fungus, then it should be okay to move into the winter taking those few precautions. But take a good look at the plants. If it looks like the plants are rotting, then yes, go ahead and rip them out and start over again. I just built a raised bed this week, as a matter of fact, to get it all ready to go in these weeks of fall when the temperatures are ideal for working outside, with the intent of it being a strawberry bed for next year. And of course, you'll see a video on how I plant my bare root strawberries. They're very easy to do. It's relatively inexpensive when you buy them in bulk. And so if you don't want to make the effort to try to fix a fungal problem, then yes, you can rip them out, and then in the springtime just start over again. And I'll be showing some of that in that video to come next year. So it's completely up to you as to how much effort you want to take. I hate admitting defeat in the garden most of the time, so I usually try to fix the problem rather than rip it out. But if you're noticing that the plants are affected and weak and decaying, then ripping them out may be the best course of action. And it's easy to put in new strawberry plants from bare root. That's actually the method I've used the most when I'm starting a new strawberry patch. I will, in summertime, when I spread my strawberries to another place, and I have a video about propagating strawberries, I will pot up the daughter plants, those runners, and I'll plant them elsewhere. But when I'm starting a new bed, I started in spring with bare root strawberries, so that by summertime I've got good plants that are growing, and it has worked well for me over the years. And so just be aware that that's the kind of thing that it's all a question of how much effort you want to put into it to determine how much or how big a problem it really is. And so talking about the beds, that's one reason why I built a bed this week. I think the changing of the seasons is a really good time to focus on your raised beds. Building raised beds in fall, filling them with new soil, putting all that organic matter into that soil in the fall, I think is one of the best ways to get a head start on your garden, and one of the best ways to really build a good soil, because everything I'm doing now at the end of September and beginning of October is preparation for beds that I'm not going to be growing in until April and May. So I have all of October and November and December and January and February and March. I've got 6 full months before I'm going to be doing anything with those beds. So that's 6 months for the soil life to grow and to really become healthier than just a bare bed that you're growing for the first time. It's not going to be perfect. It takes a couple years, but at least that 6 months gives me a head start for a new bed. Moving from winter into spring, it's the same idea. The soil is starting to warm up. The microbes are springing to life and repopulating the bed. And so if you didn't do the fall preparation, this is a good time of year, moving into a springtime for some of you, to do the same thing. Instead of adding some of the raw material that I might add in fall. So in fall, I'll add crushed leaves and I'll add grass clippings, and it's more of a rough material. But in spring, I focus on compost, material that's already decomposed or mostly decomposed, to add to my soil so that the soil life doesn't have to work so hard to release those nutrients for the plants. But this time of year, think about your soil. Start looking at what you can do to make your soil better, and then give it the time that it needs to develop before you're going to be putting plants in it. And so for those of you that are just now switching to springtime, sure, it might be a warmer area and you're able to grow earlier, but that's why I do it at the end of winter, beginning of spring, because it gives me a couple months for that compost to become part of the soil and for those microbes to be active. So when you do it in spring, it's best if you give yourself and your soil some time for that new compost to be available for the plants, based on how healthy the soil life is in that particular bed. So it's a never-ending kind of thing to keep moving forward as you're improving your soil. And I saw it in my enclosed garden area this year, that the tomato plants that I show in some of my videos recently, the ones where the black creme are doing better, much better this year than last year. It's because the soil is one more year older, and therefore it's healthier. The bed that's just around the corner that is 1 year newer, the tomato plants are doing okay, but not as well. So this should become a yearly activity if you really believe in your soil. Every year add that organic matter, and I think fall is a really good time to do it. TJ the Hawk's wondering, is it possible to start new strawberry plants in the fall, or should you wait till spring? So it depends on where you live. I saw that some of you were chatting before we started the show that you're living in Florida right now and you're starting to plant brassicas because you're moving into the winter, but you can still grow plants. That's really what it comes down to with strawberries. If you live in a region where the winters are not that harsh and you still have a couple months for the strawberry plants to get established, then it's not too late. But if you live in an area like mine in Colorado or in some of the areas farther north, it might be too late, because anytime you're putting a new plant in the ground, you want to give that plant time for the roots to become established before it goes dormant and before winter sets in. So if you can get full-size plants, if your nursery is having a closeout sale on strawberry plants, then yes, by all means, give it a try, because those plants already have a root system and you can put them in the garden. And for many of us, we have at least a month, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 before the really cold temperatures come, and that's enough time for those strawberry plants to become established. But if you're propagating from the runners, like I show in the video I referenced, those roots are going to be very small, And those very young plants, if that's what you're planting in other areas, if that's what you're starting, then it might not be enough time. I did some experimenting with that last year, both in a raised bed and also in my green stock, where I, about this time of year, took some of those small plants that were runners that I had potted up, and I planted them in other areas to see how well they would do. They didn't do well at all. And especially in the green stock. In a container, you really need an established root system going into the cold winter. So DJ, if you've got moderate temperatures ahead and at least 2 or 3 months of good warm soil conditions, then it's probably not too late. But if it's going to be changing soon, then it is better to start in the spring. And so that's why I say when I start my strawberries, I start them in spring, because those new plants aren't going to do well in a Colorado winter, but they'll do fine in a Colorado spring. So Urban Chicken Mama is wondering, haven't been here in a while. What are you doing with your greenhouse over the winter? Thanks. So good question. So I'm going to be experimenting with what I do in my greenhouse. I'm planning on experimenting with overwintering some of my pepper plants. And so I'm going to dig up some of my pepper plants and overwinter some in the house, and overwinter some in my garage, and overwinter some in my greenhouse. And so from that perspective, I'm using the greenhouse as an experimental location to see how big a difference it's going to make in the winter time. I also have my fig trees. I've got 2 fig trees in my greenhouse, and they're doing great, to the point that they're about 4 feet tall right now. This is the first year that they're growing. So I'm going to be doing pruning, just like any other location. I'll be pruning the fig trees at the depth of winter when they've gone to that point of dormancy, that I'll be pruning them. I'm also thinking about, I haven't fully decided, but I'm thinking about growing some lettuce plants. And actually Eli, with her green stock and winter garden that she'll be growing, kind of has me thinking that I'm going to see if I can do some lettuces and some spinach and some of the cool season plants in my greenhouse in the ground in the lower bed I have, and see how well they do. So I'm not committed to that yet, because I don't like to go out and garden when it's too cold out, and I'm not convinced that I'll be giving the garden all the attention, the greenhouse garden, all the attention it deserves if I do that. So I'll have to get back to you on that. So those are a couple ideas, but I haven't completely decided yet what I'm doing in my greenhouse, other than those couple ideas. But you never know, I may end up becoming quite active in the greenhouse. And if that happens, you'll definitely see it on Instagram and probably a YouTube video as well. Hi, Jen Van Brunt. Got on the drip irrigation bandwagon this year. If I get freezing temperatures for a couple of months midwinter, do I have to pull up the drip system to prevent it getting damaged? Possibly. So particularly the emitters, if there's water in those emitters and then you have a freeze, it's going to crack the plastic of those emitters, and that's definitely the damage that you'll see. The plastic tubes are less likely to have damage if they freeze. A lot of those smaller tubes can expand and contract if there's a little bit of moisture in there. The best thing you can do is to try to drain the system and get as much moisture as you can out of it before you get those freezing conditions. And then you might consider putting a cover over the bed to keep water getting in. Because what will happen if you get all the water out of your drip irrigation system, but you leave it exposed to the elements, and then you have snow, well, as the snow melts, some of that snow is going to get back into some of those emitters and then potentially refreeze in the future. So the best way to ensure that you won't have damage is to pull them up and hang them in a shed or a garage and then put it all back in place next year. I left, it's been a number of years ago when I was using drip irrigation at a previous house, and I left some of the lines in place over the winter, and that's what happened. Come springtime, it was the emitters, those drip heads that were pretty much unsalvageable. As I remember, I lost, I think, almost all of them. But it's just because of the freezing and the thawing, and the freezing and the thawing. And that hard plastic of the emitters can't always deal with those conditions. So if you've got multiple areas of the drip irrigation, again, experiment. See how your winter in particular deals with it. If your winter is relatively moderate, you might not need to pull it up and hang it some other location. If, like mine, you 5B gets down to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 Celsius, and it stays cold for a long time, those things that are left outside are going to be damaged. If it's not that cold for you, yeah, give it a try. Leave some of them in place, bring some of them in, and then compare at the end of the season to see if you notice a difference or not. Bud says, I really like Urban Chicken Mama and Rooted Heart's question. I know a lot of your viewers have a greenhouse, so it would be great to have a midwinter session about that. Okay, I'll keep that in mind. I am planning to do a midwinter review of my passive heating system in the greenhouse. And so that can easily be tied into or become an additional video as far as the plants that are growing in the greenhouse. So thank you for that, Bud and Urban Chicken Mama and Rooted Heart Garden. I will try to plan some winter greenhouse videos depending on what it is I decide to do. Yankee Sista, nice to see you. I have Chicago Hardy figs. That's what I've got. That show definite signs of producing some fruit for the first time. Should I pluck the fruit off? It is late for them to mature, correct? I would. That's one of those things that I'm starting to do with some of my tomato plants as well. The new fruit is appearing. There's not enough time for them to mature. The plant has a finite amount of energy. It can only absorb so much sun, and it takes that energy and puts it into its roots. It puts it into its new growth, and it puts it into the fruit. And primary in a plant's life is the fruit. And so particularly with a young fig tree, and that's the way I look at my figs, and maybe next year if I get some figs, I'm more worried about the plant surviving the winter, that I want the plant to be as strong as possible, particularly the roots. So by plucking off that young fruit that isn't going to develop, then you're allowing the plant to keep more of that energy for itself moving into the winter, which means the plant has a better chance of survival and will probably recover and start growing earlier in springtime because it's got more energy stored in its roots. So if you're not expecting or don't think that fruit has enough time, especially as it's fruiting for a first time, pluck it off, let the plant get stronger, and throw those figs in your compost pile, and it should be fine. And that holds true not with just figs, but with most of the plants, the fruiting plants that we're growing in our garden. Trees are amazing things when you understand how they grow and how they're affected by weather in particular. Most of the root growth that's going to be put into our trees is happening in the fall. The leaves have fallen off the trees, but the ground hasn't frozen yet. And so all that energy that's in the roots that was produced by those leaves, it's not going into new growing. It's not going into maintaining those leaves. It is now going into new root development. And so late in the season fruiting trees, if you see flowers and fruit because suddenly you have a warm stretch, same thing. Yeah, pluck off that fruit. There's not enough time for it to ripen in the rest of the year. You're putting the energy back into the roots, and those roots will now grow in fall and produce a stronger tree for the springtime. So lots of plants like that will do better if you pluck off the fruit when it's a lost cause, when the fruit isn't going to ripen, and the plant or the tree or the bush actually becomes more important in your planning and in your garden activities when you take a look at those kind of things and make sure that it works out. And Brian says, taking all my tomatoes down this week. Yeah, so this is the time of year, and that's on my list of things to talk about as well. We often try to eke out the last little bit of fruiting in our garden. We want the last of the cucumbers and the last of the tomatoes and the last of the peppers. But at some point, it makes more sense, especially if you have a busy schedule, to go ahead and take them out. So my tomatoes are still doing great, but my cucumbers are starting to fade. And I've had a ton of cucumbers this year. I've put up quarts and quarts of pickles already. But I'm thinking, because I've got time, because the weather is good, and because I want to amend the soil in my beds, I'm going to probably start pulling out my cucumber plants. Even though they're still alive, they're starting to fade, and the time I have while the weather is still good can be redirected to the soil and the cleanup. And so I'm guessing that may be some of what you're thinking about, Brian, is if the tomatoes have done well and you're happy with the harvest and you don't need to eke out the last of the harvest, you've got time. The weather's good. Go ahead and take out those plants, put some amendments into the soil, and then put the garden to rest for the winter. So I do a lot of that, and I really think that is an effective way to garden, to prepare for next year when it's easy to work this year. So that's kind of the approach I take with a lot of those kind of things. So in the garden with Eli and Kate says, I did see more outdoor splitting than I see in the greenhouse, reacting to one of Brian's comments. Just one of those things. We can't control the watering because of the rain. And so that's one of those issues. That's a good point. When you water your tomatoes in a protected environment like the greenhouse, it's easy to maintain consistent watering. In an area, especially like Scotland, where you're getting a lot of rain, the outdoor plants are going to get those big bursts of irrigation, which sometimes cause the tomatoes to split. So that's a good point to recognize those differences, like I was talking about earlier, between the inside and the outside. And yeah, tomato splitting is one of those. So appreciate it. And thank you, Jeanette B. And I'm so glad to share all of my information with you, and I appreciate that you'd be lost without me. My goal with all of this is that you all reach that point where you're not lost without me, that I've guided you on your journey to the point where you now know enough or know how to find out the information for yourself, that you can continue on without me on YouTube or Instagram or wherever I happen to be. But thank you for that. I plan to be here for a long time to help you all on your gardening journey, but to also help all of you get to that point where you can start sharing that information with others. And they'll make the same comment to you. It's like, oh, Jeanette, thank you so much. I'd be lost without your gardening knowledge. That point is coming. The more you garden, the chances that someone will look at you as the expert and thank you for your expertise. That's coming as well. So look for that. So Barry is saying, I noticed some powdery mildew on my zinnia plants in the garden. The flowers are still beautiful. Can I save seeds from the plants with powdery mildew? If so, should I treat the seeds? So yeah, absolutely. You can save the seeds from plants. The same with cucumbers. Now, knock on wood, I don't have powdery mildew on my cucumbers this year or on my squash, and I'm happy with that. It's actually worked out pretty well. But that's because I've been pruning and maintaining the airflow, and the conditions haven't been conducive for the powdery mildew. But even then, I've saved seeds from cucumbers on cucumber plants that were affected by powdery mildew, and the seeds do just fine, and they'll grow into new plants and do just as well. You can treat them because it's possible, especially for flowers like zinnias. Not so true for cucumbers, they're protected from the powdery mildew, but for the flower seeds, it's possible those seeds could have some of the fungal spores from the powdery mildew. And so, yeah, you might want to soak them in hydrogen peroxide. That's a very common treatment for seeds. Take your seeds, soak them in hydrogen peroxide for 30, 45 minutes, then let them dry, and that usually is enough to deal with the possibility that those fungal spores might be on those seeds. The seeds themselves should be completely viable, and unless they have some of those spores that are hitchhiking, it's not going to pose a problem moving into the future. So powdery mildew is everywhere. I've said this before. I don't do a lot, and I don't worry much about powdery mildew because it's everywhere, and those spores are blowing in the wind, and so that does increase the likelihood of the seeds having some of those hitchhiking spores if they're in an area with a lot of that powdery mildew activity. Generally, even if I have a garden with powdery mildew and I've got flowers nearby, I've never pre-treated my seeds, and I've never seen an issue where I've introduced powdery mildew into another area because it's all around us and it's blowing in the wind. So that's up to you whether you want to do that pre-treatment or not. I don't know that it would make much difference moving forward because the likelihood of the powdery mildew seems to be an ever-present problem. Hello, Colorado Bird Nerd. Thank you so much for that contribution. I appreciate it. Love your Monday lives. I'm in my second year of asparagus plants. How do I best put them to sleep for the winter? Good question. I've been working on an asparagus video for 3 years now. I'm hoping I can actually get it done next year when I harvest my asparagus for the first time. But some of what I do for putting the asparagus plants to rest, the beds to rest for the winter, is I'll wait until the asparagus plants have turned brown, and then I'll cut them off. And then back to that question about chop and drop. I chop and drop all of my asparagus plants. So usually for me, it's November, sometimes early December. I imagine that's very close to you as what you'll be seeing as well. That's about the point that the asparagus plants have turned completely brown. And so I'll get my pruners out, I'll cut it off at the base, and then I just snip it into small pieces all over the top of the asparagus bed to now become mulch to help going into winter. And then sometimes I do it in spring, but I like to do it in fall. In conjunction with that, I'll take something like alpaca manure. That's what I've used in recent years. Any other type of aged manure. Add some manure to the top of the bed, add some compost to the top of the bed, and then mulch it for the winter with like pine needles and straw or leaves, whatever you have to add as a mulch. And that's it. I just chop and drop the plants, add some more nutrients to the top, and then mulch it, and then walk away. And come springtime, the asparagus spears start emerging because they've had that nice blanket on top of them for the winter. And so it's not a lot of work. I did experiment. You know me, I love experimentation. I did leave the dried plants up one winter just to see if it had any effect whatsoever. And what I noticed was, especially in my windy Colorado area, those dried 4-foot tall asparagus plants blowing in the wind would actually create a hole at the bottom. It like was a flag waving in the wind, and where the base of the plant was in the soil, it opened up a hole And I suspect that could pose problems. And so by cutting it, you're keeping holes from developing in your asparagus patch. So thank you, Jeanette. I appreciate that so much. Thank you for that super sticker. Those are always nice to have. It's so nice. You all are such a fantastic group, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jay, as well, for commenting on Colorado Bird Nerds. And I'm scrolling down. I suspect I'll see similar things as I scroll down. So thank you so much for acknowledging the acknowledgement. Jane is saying, do seeds saved from plants with bad mildew or blight have fewer defenses, and are they more likely to grow diseased plants next year? So generally, a seed that is exposed to a fungus, a mildew, a mold, if it germinates, the plant should grow fine. Now, there are some seeds out there that might be affected because the seed is weakened by that mold. But as long as the protective barrier, as long as the shell of the seed is intact, it should grow into a full-size plant and not be impacted at all. Now, there are some diseases, particularly viral diseases and some fungal diseases, that can rest on a seed. And when you put that seed into the ground, the plant will do fine until that disease that was on the seed is now infecting the plant. And that's one of those situations, particularly if you suspect a diseased seed, you might want to do something like hydrogen peroxide to deal with that ahead of time. But generally, something like blight is not going to carry over in the seed from one generation or another. It's more likely that if you have blight in the next season, it's because it was in the soil, or it was in the mulch, or it was in the plant residue nearby, not because it was on an infected seed. But it could happen. So when you're dealing with diseases and you're saving the seed, that is one of those situations that treating the seed, making sure it's completely dry, and then doing something to try to kill the disease in storage or before you put it into storage will reduce the likelihood. But I read some research a while back on some of that, and it's very, very rare and very, very few diseases that will be carried forward in the seed. And I've never had that issue. I don't have a lot of disease problems in my garden, and I've never seen anything that was in my seeds that were carried forward. But it is better safe than sorry. So if it's something that you can prevent, if you're at all worried about it, then definitely take some of those preventive actions, and it might make a difference. Enki Sister, thank you for that. I've been very thankful for your gardening guides throughout the years. I've gained assurance and confidence in my gardening. Thank you. And you are so very welcome, and thank you for saying that. Your gardens are beautiful, and I thank you for giving me some credit, but I think it's you that's doing it after you've learned. And that's a big part of all this. That's why I keep doing it, is thank you for all the credit that you all give and all the support, but do give yourself the support and the credit, because you're putting to use the good information and carrying it to another level. So I think that's so important, that we all grow literally and figuratively as we become gardeners. Before I forget, I did want to point out the background today. This is my garden this morning, and as my season changes, I look for signs that determine what I'm going to do. Now, my cosmos flowers this year were late because we had such a cold June, and it really threw things off a little bit. But one of the things I look for moving into fall is like my sunflower plants that I have growing around the area. When they start turning brown and the seeds start turning brown, they're drying, and the birds, that's what I saw this week, the birds were starting to feed on the sunflower plants. That's one of my indicators that I use in my garden that the season is changing. The birds recognize it. They're storing up the energy for migrating or whatever they're going to be doing in the months ahead, and they're eating my sunflower seeds. That's one reason why I have sunflowers, and I leave the sunflowers growing throughout the season. But it is an indicator that my season is drawing to a close. And so as we hit the changes of the season, start looking for those kind of things that are happening in your garden and make note of it. What is different now than it was just a month ago? And is it related to the weather and what's coming in the forecasts ahead? Now, you can see if you look over my shoulder at the top of the greenhouse, there's my neighbor's tree. One thing that I'm noticing this year is that the trees are not changing color. Normally, by the end of September, the trees in my neighborhood are starting to change color because we've had some cold nights, and because it's that cold that causes the leaves and the chlorophyll shift in trees, the leaves begin to yellow. It's signifying the end of the season. Well, the trees aren't changing color in my area. They're not changing up in the mountains as well at this time of year. Normally, some of the areas in the mountains here in Colorado are already seeing the colors change. It's not happening this year because it's been so warm this summer. So I'm noting it, and I'm also gambling a little bit in thinking that because the trees are a week or two late in changing color, maybe more, that gives me an extra week or two in my garden to leave the tomatoes in the ground, to leave the peppers in the ground, to try to get the last of the fruit. So this is one of those things that every year is different, but learning some of these things that are happening in our garden and trying to figure out how it's going to affect our gardening activities moving forward, particularly in the changing of the seasons, I'm hoping that I have a gardening season well into October. 2 years ago, my season ended the third week of September. Last year, it was the first week of October. And as I look at our long-range forecast, I might actually be making it into the second or third week of October, which is just crazy in my area. So it's going to be well past the average first frost date, which gives me opportunity to not only work in the garden and spend time developing the soil, but it's also giving me time to do new garden beds and start new building in areas that I hadn't planned because the trees are telling me that I have more time. So, like I said, it's a gamble. We'll just have to wait and see. But take a look at your garden and see what's happening and see if there's some of those kind of things that might be beneficial for you as you move forward in the years ahead. If it's a lesson you can learn this year and then carry it forward, I think it really works out pretty well. Colorado Bird Nerd again. Gardner Scott and Chatting Gardeners. Love you guys. I'm quiet here, but I'm busy taking notes for my gardening journal and all the incredible information I hear from everyone. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for recognizing and acknowledging all of the others. That's one of the best things. I know a lot more people watch this in replay than watch it live. Let's see, we've got about 150 right now that are on. That's a little bit lower than normal, but there's going to be a few thousand that watch it in replay. All of you who are watching it in replay are doing the same thing. You're looking at the comments and you're taking notes. Those of us that are doing it live, particularly me, I miss a lot that's happening in the comments. So yes, absolutely. Kudos, thank yous to all of you who are commenting while I'm talking to help out others and to give good information. Because I'll go back as well and look at the comments and see what's happening because you all know what you're doing. And the questions, this is one of those things, having been an instructor for many, many years in different areas of my life, you can often tell by the question how knowledgeable the person is. And you all ask very intelligent questions. They tell me that you really are understanding the process and you really are understanding gardening to be able to ask some of the questions that you all ask. And then the answers, of course, are absolutely fantastic. So keep doing that. Keep participating and keep making me a happy person on Mondays. Britt Lee, I want to share a special garden experience. My aunt came to visit and is a biologist. She's studying monarchs, and because I get so many, she observed them in my garden. Our gardens do make a difference. Good for you, Britt. That's fantastic. It's something that you just I say sharing the garden is something that we all should do. I think that others that come to our garden benefit from it, especially when a biologist can come to your garden and be affected by it. That's just fantastic. But this really does highlight why I think sharing gardens is just such a fantastic opportunity, and it's definitely something that we should all aspire to. So good for you that not only are you sharing your garden, but your aunt is able to see something that you're doing, like with the monarchs. I grow milkweed. I haven't seen a monarch since my youth in Nevada, and I'm hoping someday monarchs will fly through my part of Colorado and they'll see my milkweed plants, and I'll help increase the monarch population. But I'm not able to do that. So I'm a bit jealous of you, Britt, that you do have so many monarchs in your garden, and you're obviously doing things right to have them there. So good for you. That's absolutely fantastic. Ladies Garden Home, thank you for teaching us so well. Well, again, thank you so much for that. Thank you for that donation. I do appreciate it. I love doing this stuff. This is the kind of thing that, you know, your comments definitely make a difference in my life, and I'm so glad that I can affect others. And so a quick shout out to Rick, who is saying good night in Sydney. Thanks for joining us. If you happen to see this in replay or still on, thanks for joining us. It's always nice. And that's one I wanted to talk about, partly because of Rick and some of the others in Australia who are entering springtime and having to think about what they're going to do in their garden. And sometimes we get so focused on the activities ahead that we lose sight of where we were and what we could have done. And so preparing in fall for the spring, I think, just makes that spring transition so much easier. But if you are transitioning to spring, make note of the things you wish you had done the previous fall and do it again this year so that you don't have to worry so much about it moving forward. So talking about sharing your gardens, I was going to talk about this last week, but of course didn't have the opportunity. Had a couple young guys, and they haven't released a video yet, but it's two dudes, Too dudes, and they have a small YouTube channel. They are walking through every state in the United States. It's going to be a 3-year project, and they came to Colorado and they contacted me and asked if they could visit my garden. And of course I said yes, and they filmed it. They're planning on putting out a video at some point about their visit to Gardner Scott's garden. But the reaction, seeing their reaction, and of course my reaction to their reaction, just makes the whole gardening thing so fantastic. They're 20 years old. They're out of school. They're doing this activity. They're trying to raise money periodically to pay for the trip. So they're doing some side hustles like the DoorDash kind of thing to just be able to support themselves. They're learning new things. They're seeing new things. And the idea of visiting an old guy's garden popped into their heads, and they did it. And I had them harvesting tomatoes that they could take with them. And they harvested some cucumbers. And we talked about the garden, and it was all new to them. And it was so fantastic for me to take them around the garden and expose them to the sun gold tomato. And then they tasted the sweet million tomato. And then they tasted the black cherry tomato. And each one is different and it's a whole new experience. And I just love that. I love sharing that with others, especially when it's face to face. And so, like with an aunt coming to the garden, if you have that opportunity of a family member or even a stranger who shows an interest in what you're doing, I say do it. I say get out there, make it happen, because it will be a growing experience for both of you and definitely become a memory for both of you moving forward. So I'll never forget these guys coming to my garden and me giving them the opportunity to do something that they had never done before. So take that as an opportunity, if you would. Dennis Blevins is a new member of the Gardner Scott community. So thank you for that, Dennis. I've talked about it before, but do make sure that you check on some of the new things. I see that you are now in the garden training level. So at the training and collaboration level, we do extra things like I'll do at least one, sometimes more, members only live streams for the members that are the paid YouTube community. And I'm doing one today. So Dennis, if you didn't know, stick around. We'll be finishing here in a couple minutes. And then in about 15 or 20 minutes, I'll be doing a members only live stream. Much smaller group. We get to chat about our own individual gardens and get all of our questions answered. So hopefully, Dennis, I will see you there in just a little bit. So thank you thank you for upgrading to that training level of membership and getting that extra perk. It's always so nice. And thank you, Jay, always on top of it for thanking Dennis as well. So it's always nice that we can say hello to each other and all the rest of it. It's something that the Monday, I really did miss last week. And thank you to all of you who said you also missed our Mondays together. And I was so looking forward to getting us all back together this week. And of course, I'll be back next week. I had a guest planned next week, or last week. And so I've got her reprogrammed for October 16th, I think it is. So we'll talk about that as we get closer to that date. And I've got some other guests that are being lined up in the weeks ahead as well. So as we move forward into fall and then to winter and then those cold, dark months that some of us don't enjoy because we're not outside gardening, stay gardening. One of the best ways you can stay gardening is participating in the Monday live streams and watching videos and maybe getting a new book and researching something you're interested in. The YouTube gardening world really begins to shrink in fall and winter, to the point I see it on my channel. I know Eli and Kate see it on their channel. People stop watching gardening videos. And I think this is the ideal time of year to actually start watching more gardening videos. I was talking about preparing your soil in fall for your springtime growing. I think you should be preparing your mind, your brain, accumulating that knowledge. Do that in fall so that by the time spring comes, you've already got a good plan in place. You already know what you're going to be doing, and you take a lot of the guesswork out of it. So your garden may be put to bed for the winter, but don't put yourself to bed when it comes to that knowledge increase, and particularly the YouTube videos. Keep doing it. I'm going to be here whether anyone watches or not, but I think it can benefit you if you do watch and you do stay active and you do it with an intent, with that focus of I'm going to keep learning. Even though I can't go out and do it right now, I'm going to keep learning so that when I can do it in 6 months, I'll have all the information I need. So hope that gives you a little bit of inspiration and motivation to get out there. And yeah, Laura says, I couldn't imagine not watching my gardening channels. And I'm the same way. It's one of those things that it it's part of my daily activities, and so I can't imagine not doing it. And I am not necessarily watching new videos because most of the gardening creators are not making videos in the winter because their gardens aren't alive anymore. I still make videos throughout the year, but you can still go back and watch the spring videos in fall to prepare for next spring when those videos are going to be more appropriate. So just do be aware of that. Jimmy's wondering, will the members only stream give me a notification? Don't think I've seen one before. So if you are subscribed to the channel, then and you've clicked on the bell notification, then yes, I believe you'll get a notification. That holds true with any time a video comes out or anytime anything is happening on the channel. If you're not subscribed and you haven't clicked the bell to be notified, then no, you don't always get a notification. Though usually, and this holds true with all the channels that you watch a lot of videos on, when you go to your homepage, you'll see it pop up on your homepage because YouTube knows that you're interested. Another reason to keep watching the videos of not only mine, but other channels that you like as well, because when new videos come out, they're more likely to show up on your homepage so that you don't miss out on the opportunity. So, and so Jimmy's wondering what level. It is the training and collaboration level for the YouTube videos or the live streams and some of the other perks that we offer here in the community. If you're at the support level, you get the YouTube or you get the Facebook group and some other various perks, but the live streams are at the higher levels for that. So hope that helps out, and I do need to go and prepare for that. We've hit 91 minutes. Doesn't the time fly? So one of the reasons that I'm showing you my garden today is because I'm running out of videos or running out of backgrounds to show in these live streams. So send me your pictures, send me your gardens, and I'll try to show it in the background, especially if fall gardens and winter gardens. Those are just as good as the good spring, summer green gardens. Take it in landscape. Try to tell me a little bit of a backstory about it if you would. Give me permission to use it, and you may see it as a backdrop in the months ahead, because I like showing your gardens actually more than I like showing my garden, because I like to see what you all are doing. I always learn something from that. So that is definitely something to take advantage of. And hey, Jimmy, there you are, upgrading your membership as well. So I hope to see you here in a few minutes on the members live stream. And if you're not a member, don't worry about it. I'll be back next Monday. We'll still talk like we do every Monday. All the videos are still free. That's just an extra way you can help support my channel. So have a great gardening week. I hope the weather supports your gardening week and gives you time to get some of those things done that you're hoping to get done. And I'll see you back here next Monday. I'm Gardner Scott. Of course, enjoy gardening.